It's great to be here with you guys. I been in open source for a long time. I'm always been an advocate and always been an enthusiast on all things open source. And I had the opportunity to work with a team and put together a very complete survey just at the end of last year, first week of this year. And we have very interesting results of what's going on in open source, especially when you use that open source in organizations across all industries. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, a little bit of different presentation. I'm going to show you multiple charts. But first, quick introduction. I'm Chief Evangelist for Perforce, work directly with the OpenLogic brand, which we offer open source technical support for open source packages. As I said, I've been in open source for a long time, at least 12 years directly involved with communities, with successful open source projects. I work for companies like Red Hat, just more recently with IBM running one of the open source programs. So love to be an advocate, love to talk about open source and technologies, also about open source security, which I know we have plenty of sessions, very interesting sessions all day about all aspects of open source. And it will be, it's great to start with a kind of high level view of what's going on in those organizations, right? So this is a survey. We actually partnered with OSI, with the Open Source Initiative. And when we started as a kind of a North American small survey, all of a sudden became global, right? We had more than 2,600 responses from all over the world. You can see the numbers there. I believe we had like 8 or 9 friends from New Zealand and Australia, which made me very, very happy. Hopefully they are listening or they're going to watch the recording of this. And we really had a survey across all industries, at least the top 10 major verticals, industries, for small, medium, and large organizations. And so that gives us a really good view of what's going on, right? I mean, this is just a couple of months old. What are the popular open source projects? What are people thinking in terms of organizations adopting or using more open source? So we started with a very simple question, right? Has your organization increased the use of open source software over the last year, right? And we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? A global pandemic. We asked this to all that large audience, and we had a 76.5, or if we round it up, 77% say yes, they increased the use of open source software over the last year in their organizations, right? 36% of them say significantly, and we let everyone kind of define their own meaning for significantly, but that means more, right? That means a lot more. And you see the number there. Only 1.6% say they reduced the use of open source over the last 12 months, and looking into the details, it looks like these people they're also using other open source, right? It's not like they stopped using open source. It had to do with, looks like it had to do with the end of life of CentOS, which I'll mention a little bit later on that. And I think most of you know that that was one of the major news last year, or end of life on December 31st, 2021. So the other big piece here, and you're going to have a chance to look into the charts while I'm talking, but the only big piece thing here is for organizations, open source is not just about 1 or 2 technologies, right? It's not just about programming languages and Linux or Linux distributions. It's about all technologies, right? I mean, these are just sample logos there, but it's about everything, right? And really the percentages really doesn't matter really that much, because what we found is all the respondents in the organizations, they use 3, 4 full stacks, 50 or more. I mean, and developers were talking about the different libraries they use. So we're talking about now hundreds and thousands of open source libraries, right? So the bottom line here is it's very clear. It's no longer a question if open source is it's a trend or not. And it's here to stay. It's going to grow, and it's going to continue to grow. And we are in this audience. We're in right in the right place, right? Always willing to learn about new technologies and always trying to innovate and add more functionality to their existing open source projects. So we ask at the high level, what are the overall reasons to use the different open source software that you have in your organizations? And globally, overall results, the #1 reason was access to innovation, okay? Access to innovation, not just because it's free and reduced cost. #1 was access to innovation. #3 overall was to modernize technology stacks, right? Which talked about very much the same or different aspect. When we split that per region, that's when we found a little bit of differences. As you can see there on the chart, in UK and Europe, still the no license cost, overall cost reduction, top #1, but not by far. They also talked about less lock-in, which I know many of the vendors talked about that. Many of the vendors kind of commercializing open source talk about that. But the bottom line here is, and I think all of you will agree, is the reason to use open source is access to innovation, right? That's where things are happening across all technologies, AI, machine learning, deep learning, IoT, you name it, right? So, and then we ask, what are the barriers to use more open source? It's not like to use open source anymore. It's more about to use more open source, right? And interesting at the high level, then we went and asked specific technologies. But at the high level, I mean, it was that, like, really the barrier is the lack of internal skills, right? And we know this, there are a lot of very interesting programs there to educate, to train, to enable developers and non-developers on the different technologies. But that's a barrier, right? They're already using open source software. Maybe, well, we want to go into more use of containers, large deployments where we need orchestration, we might need Kubernetes. We don't have anyone that has those skills. So definitely that was listed as the #1. Curiously, one of the options at the very end option was, I don't have any reservations, and that ended up being #2 of reservations about using open source. And the other one that I found curious is, you'd see that at the bottom, is that about 9%, 10% say, I can't convince my manager. That's a very low percentage, right? So I think we can convince the leadership or executives that open source is a good thing. That's where the innovation is happening, and we should be using the latest technologies. Now, when we went and asked on the specific technologies, remember that other list with all the logos, we focus on 3 things. What are the most used, most popular, the most used open source projects? What were the reasons to use or to select those technologies? And then what were the support challenges with those technologies, right? See, from our organization's perspective, what's their thinking there? And you'll see that on the first table there, the top reasons were, well, I selected this technology because of the security and availability of patches. I selected this, data technology because of the stability and robustness. And I selected this technology because we already have people that have the experience and the proficiency. Now, when you see on the next table, when we ask the specific support challenges on those technologies, they actually correlate very much with the other table, right? So they selected that technology because of the availability of security, availability of patches. But a support issue is that just to keep up with updates and patches, right? Now that we see more and more in the news, things related to security, right? Log4j and other things, there's more awareness, which is great. There are fixes for the vulnerabilities, which is great. But the challenge for organizations is to keep up with those updates and those patches, right? #2 was, and by the way, depending on the technology, it changed in kind of the order, but overall, these were the top 3. #2 is kind of they want a technology with stability and robustness, the best technology, but the support challenge is, have the expertise to upgrade, to do the configuration, to properly deploy those, right? And then on the third piece was the personal experience and proficiency, the main, not necessarily the lack of resources or personnel, but actually the personal experience and proficiency. So overall, that's what we found on the different technologies. And just really quick to go through some of the technologies, you can see on the charts, very interesting around Linux distribution. Ubuntu continues to be now the most used, the most popular. CentOS is going down. As I said, CentOS went end of life at the end of last year, so we saw a reduction there. Some of the forks or some of the kind of distributions that started from CentOS, like Rocky Linux, Alma Linux, Navy Linux. Now they seem to be making some progress there, people using them. Programming languages, no surprises, Java, JavaScript, Python. JavaScript, we split it into kind of Java, Oracle Java, OpenJDK, OpenJ9. Obviously, in terms of the infrastructure, we saw a lot of OpenStack, and depending on the industry, more use of OpenStack, even more than Kubernetes. So some interesting results there. In terms of DevOps tooling, there's so much, right? We had to split it on multiple categories. The other thing that, by the way, you will probably already notice on the charts, we try as much as possible to make it only about open source software, but you'll see there are a few exceptions there, like on the Linux distributions, or now that you see there on GitHub Actions, but they have to be part of the ecosystem, so we had to put them on the survey. Very interesting with CI/CD tools, that the ones that now are kind of cloud native, container based, are getting a lot of traction. Jenkins X passed at Jenkins with our respondents, more than 2,600, and others that are container based, like Spinnaker and Tecton and others, right? So very, very interesting results. Organizations using CI/CD tool, as well as automation orchestration tools, and very small percentage in terms of not using them, but I'm sure that's gonna grow. In terms of open source technologies, I mean, we can't talk about databases anymore, right? It's data technologies, and probably no surprises there. Still very popular, MySQL and Postgres, and even for the small organizations, they still use it. We as I said, this report, this study, this research with the survey with OSI, and there's some issues there with licenses on things like MongoDB or Elastic, right, which are not technically considered open source, but we listed there, had to be there, and you can see the results, and you can see also the support challenges with align with what I mentioned earlier. In terms of the maturity, and just to end the session with a couple of more stats here, you can see through the chart. I mean, these are some of the most important aspects when you see a company in terms of the maturity in their the use of open source software, right? So really quick, 4 results there. The retail industry reported as the highest use of open source software. Manufacturing, the lowest rate of experts when we ask you have experts on the different open source technologies. Banking, insurance, and financial services with the most inner source projects, which is very, very interesting, right? We see a growth of inner source projects. And then healthcare and pharma with the highest rate of open source security, open source program offices, OSPOs. There's not exactly a correlation, not the same organizations that have OSPOs have inner source projects, or inner source projects having OSPOs. It's about 20% overlap, but that's really, really interesting, and hopefully we'll see that growing. And just to finish my talk really quick here, we ask about what's next, right? What are your desirable technologies? And we listed what you see there on the table, from data science and Kubernetes to virtual reality or NFTs, and even quantum computing. And we ask how important or least important are. No question that the desire of doing more with, or start using Kubernetes, or doing more with Kubernetes operators, that's the most important, at least on the short term. But we also saw about everything, right? NFTs maybe is the least important, but you can see the percentages there. There's still interest on technology companies to go or across the industries to go and do more. So with that, there's a report there that you can download if you want to read. It's a 77-page report, but we were very happy to see these results, right? And very common, the fact that things are moving along, that we're looking about innovation, that there's more use and more maturity in the use of open source. And hopefully you see a lot of more of that all day with all the sessions. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the time and the invitation, Todd, and take it away.